For tonight's reading, you're reading pages 260 to page 266. So let's talk about, first of all, what a colony means. So colonies are places that have a dependency on another country or another sovereign state. They usually have areas of special sovereignty. So, for example, the U.S. Department of State lists 68 places in the world that are classified as dependencies or areas of special sovereignty, which means they are still current day colonies. 43 of those 68 places have indigenous populations, and 25 of them have no permanent population. So they're places where we have research bases or naval or other army bases. Most current colonies today are in the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea. For example, the U.S., we have a Commonwealth. Puerto Rico is a Commonwealth of the United States. There are 4 million residents who are U.S. citizens, but they don't participate formally in U.S. elections, and they don't have a voting member of Congress, although they do have a member of Congress who can advise and observe. And so here are most of the world's special dependencies today. And again, over here in the Pacific Ocean, same thing over here. And so you might have something like the Cook Islands, right? Or the Marshall Islands, Midway Islands. This would be a place with not much of a permanent population. So in the reading tonight, you're going to look at boundaries. And there's some more vocab you need to go through in the book. But I kind of want to go over some of the major terminology for you. So a state is separated from its neighbors by a boundary. It's an invisible line that marks the extent of a state's territory. Historically, a frontier is a zone where no state has complete control. And there's not many frontiers left, right? So that's why, like in Star Trek, they call it the final frontier, because most of our sovereign powers have established boundaries. So we have you have physical boundaries, cultural boundaries, and geometric boundaries. So if you look at physical boundaries, you've got 3 main types that can form a boundary between states. So you could have a desert boundary. Deserts really effectively divide 2 different sovereign states or countries because deserts are hard to cross and they're usually sparsely inhabited. People aren't usually fighting over desert territory historically because there wasn't much room for agriculture there because it's a desert. So usually deserts make a natural kind of border because it's lands that people necessarily didn't want. And again, they are still hard to cross today, but imagine crossing them without, planes or cars or jeeps. I guess the exception to desert territory people not wanting might be desert territory with oil under it now. Mountains are also natural physical boundaries between countries, particularly when the mountains are very hard to cross. They are useful as boundaries because they have, again, a permanent quality. They don't really move unless you blow them up. And mountains often are sparsely populated. So mountains are sparsely populated, again, because they're hard to cross and they're hard to move across, particularly historically. And then the third type of physical boundary might be a water boundary. So rivers make great boundaries, lakes, oceans. They are sometimes less permanent overall than a mountain because water levels can change. River channels move over time. So the Rio Grande, which is a river that borders the U.S. and Mexico, the Rio Grande has moved several times as it's changed its pattern. So as the water levels increase or decrease, and as time goes by, the river channels change, and so it makes a much more difficult boundary between the U.S. and Mexico. And so here is, just a picture of the ocean. You can see that as the tide changes, as sea levels rise, the ocean, even though it's very permanent, often doesn't always make the best boundary because it kind of eats away at your territory. We also have something called cultural boundaries. So cultural boundaries are usually kind of like geometric. So cultural boundaries are Cultural boundaries are drawn. They're drawn in a line. So a cultural boundary would be something that a cultural geometric boundary would be something that usually goes along like lines of latitude or lines of longitude. So like the straight line for the 49-degree north latitude that separates the US and Canada, which we had a war in the early 1800s to establish. That's a geometric boundary. And then another cultural boundary type would be an ethnic boundary. So if you have an ethnic cultural boundary for your country, this means the boundary is going to coincide with differences in ethnicity, like language or religion. So language differences influence the demarcation of boundaries in England, France, Portugal, and Spain before the 19th century or the 1800s in Europe. Some other terms you need to be familiar with would be something like antecedent. Antecedent means that it was there from prehistoric times, so it's pre-existing. A relic is a former state border that still has cultural meaning. Subsequent, that's a new boundary line that results from a cultural change or conflict. And superimposed, that's when we put them down for political reasons over a normal cultural boundary. So just be familiar with these terms. They're in your book: antecedent, relic, subsequent, and superimposed. So within a country, you might have an enclave. An enclave is a minority ethnic group that's concentrated within a larger country. The prefix en means in, so just like enclave, or in biology might be like endocytosis, moving into a cell. So enclave within the country. And an example would be Quebec, which within Canada. So there's a group of French-speaking Canadians. They are a minority population compared to the rest of Canada, and it's completely surrounded by Canada. And sometimes Quebec wants to be separate, right? But it hasn't had enough votes to be separated from Canada. So you have that enclave. An exclave is a fragmented piece of a territory. So X means out. So they are outside the boundary of this territory. They are separated from a state or a country by usually another country. So an example would be Alaska. Alaska is separated from the rest of the mainland U.S. by Canada. So an exclave. And the concept of borders and boundaries clearly coincides to border conflicts, right? And so a famous example of a superimposed border, right, or again, those borders or boundaries that are placed over cultural boundaries, will be particularly sub-Saharan Africa. So the Conference of Berlin was in 1884, and all the European colonial powers kind of got together, and they decided that they were beginning to leave Africa. They were going through the process of decolonization. And so as they were leaving Africa, they met and decided on where these internal political borders would be within Africa. But they didn't use the, antecedent borders or relic borders. They just divided it up in a way that made sense to them. But it didn't look at religious or language barriers or tribal groups within sub-Saharan Africa. So ultimately, this led to several conflicts today that we can trace their roots back to this Conference of Berlin and that colonial legacy on the entire African continent. So probably the most well-known border conflict within Africa that you can trace to this Conference of Berlin was the 1994 Rwandan genocide between the Hutu and the Tutsis. It happened in April of 1994. In 1 month, 400,000 Rwandans died, and an estimated another 100,000 before the conflict ended, bringing the total up to 500,000. The 1994 Rwandan genocide was a continuation of a pattern of ethnic cleansing that began in the 1960s after Rwanda, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo all had self-determination. So the Hutu and the Tutsis are spread out through Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And these overlapping territories had a history of conflict. So as different groups came to power, as different tribes came into power and lost power, this led to generations of resentment. And when Europeans made Rwanda one country, it included both Hutu and Tutsis whose history with each other, predated Europeans. So they had minor tribal conflicts before Europeans were there. So it really created like this powder keg that finally in 1994 again led to the death of 400,000 people in 1 month. Um, this conflict, even as it was resolved within Rwanda, continued on. It spilled over through the borders of Burundi and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So when we talk about the colonial legacy, we really are leaving this legacy of sometimes war, conflict, and ethnic cleansing. One last border type that your book talks about is what do we do about naval borders, right, or marine borders. So the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea says that your sovereign territory, so the laws of all of your country or your sovereign state, extend 12 nautical miles from the shore. So from the shore of your country, 10 nautical miles outside, you could, if somebody was fleeing the country and they were on a boat, you could arrest them and charge them there. So after you are 12 nautical miles out, you are considered to be in the high seas, and the laws of the sea of the country do not apply to you, although there are some international laws that would still apply. However, your exclusive economic zone extends 200 nautical miles from your shore. So your ability to control the natural resource extraction, exploration extends to 200 nautical miles off its shore. So, for example, the US or Russia or China, all of these places can drill for oil up to 200 nautical miles from the shore. You can mine for minerals up to 200 miles from your shore, and you control, of course, fishing rights 200 nautical miles from your shore. The one exception to both of these laws might be things like the International Whaling Commission, which has banned whaling internationally, except for a few indigenous groups within countries that traditionally eat whales. And some species of whales are completely banned, even for indigenous groups. So that's one of the few global exceptions. What this means is if you can extend how far your territory goes, then you've now extended your nautical, your EEZ. So we'll talk about that a bit more in class.